Let's get it, Luis. Let's get it. Good deeds, bad deeds, Mr. Deeds, none of those deeds. We're talking about real estate, property deeds on this episode of unBILLABLE. This episode is all about deeds, not Mr. Deeds. We're talking about deeds, property deeds. What's so important about a deed? A deed tells us, who's us, the court system, the legal system, who the owner of a property is. Many times it's the court system that's determining who is the owner, so you want to make sure your deed is accurate. So when you own a property by yourself, you own that property fee simple absolute. You own the property by yourself, everything in the property. Yeah, I mean, what if there's a diamond mine in the ground underneath? It's yours. What if there's oil in that dirt? It's yours as well. Fee simple absolute. One person owns the property. Okay, end of episode. Well, no, of course not. What happens when there's more than one owner of a property? We call that concurrent ownership. Listen to that fancy name, concurrent. Two at the same time, multiple at the same time. If you have 2, 3, 4, 5, all of those, even more, considered concurrent ownership. Let's get a little bit into the details of concurrent ownership, multiple owners of the single piece of property on this episode. When multiple people own a single piece of property, the presumption, in other words, when you don't make clear it's something else, the presumption is that ownership is tenants in common. So tenants in common, what does that mean? Each owner, let's say there's 3, each of the 3 owners has an equal undivided ownership interest. Well, what does that mean? They don't have like one person gets the kitchen and a bathroom, another person gets a bedroom and part of the backyard. Not like that. They each have an undivided ownership interest in the whole thing. Each is a tenant in common with the others. Now, when they die, they can leave their interest in the property to an heir. They can sell their interest in the property to someone else. They can gift it. Each one has an undivided interest in the whole, tenants in common. Remember, if you don't make clear what your ownership structure is, the court will assume that you're tenants in common. As a tenant in common, you can transfer your interest, as I said before. Most importantly, you can do that without the consent of the other tenants in common. It's your ownership of an undivided interest in the whole. You're a tenant in common. So when is it a good time to use tenancy in common? When is it a good time to be tenants in common? Well, anytime that you want to share the ownership, yet keep your interests your own. For example, let's say you and a friend want to go halves on a beach house or maybe a home in the mountains. I'd come visit you. I mean, that's a good time to use tenants in common because maybe you're going to want to sell your half interest at some point, or maybe you're going to want to give it away to someone else, and you're not going to need the permission of your co-tenant in common. So tenants in common is a great opportunity for you to be a co-owner when you want to retain your rights with regard to your undivided interest in the property. So if tenants in common is the presumption, then there must be something else. There must be another way to hold ownership as multiple people on the same piece of property, and there is. It's called joint tenancy. Now, joint tenancy has an interesting little wrinkle. It's called the right of survivorship. What it means is if 3 people own a piece of property, when one of them dies, they don't give it to their heirs. Oh no. When one of them dies, the remaining joint tenants, they sort of absorb that ownership. So think about it. If let's say me, you, and my man Luis holding the camera, let's say the 3 of us own a piece of property as joint tenants. When, let's say Luis dies, sorry buddy, then me and you, we went from being 1/3 owners with Luis to being 50-50 owners with each other. He doesn't give it to his heirs. We're joint tenants with rights of survivorship. Now going back to tenants in common, let's go back and let's do me, you, and Luis, same thing. If we're tenants in common, and once again, my man Luis here meets his early demise, sorry buddy, he could give it to his heirs. His will would dictate who became the co-owner as tenants in common. But we're not talking about tenants in common anymore. We're talking about joint tenancy with the right of survivorship. So does this create an incentive for me and you to maybe kill Luis? I mean, if you're worried that someone's gonna kill you for the property, don't be partners with them. Of course not. So what's a good way or a good time to use joint tenancy? A husband and wife. When a husband and wife take ownership to a piece of property, it's a great time to use joint tenancy because if a husband is to die, it's likely he's going to want to leave it to his wife, and as a wife is to die, it's likely she'll want to leave it to her mom. Even if she wants to leave it to her mom, it won't matter if you're joint tenants with right of survivorship. Before I get murdered for the little joke here, right? It won't matter. If you're joint tenants with right of survivorship, it would go to the husband anyways. Like, that's the point. That's why it's a good time to use it. If, like me, you're from the beautiful state of California, you're probably thinking to yourself, well, what about community property? What does community property have to do with any of this? Community property has to do with assets acquired during a marriage. When I'm talking about tenants in common or joint tenancies, we're talking about ownership on a deed, multiple people owning a property and how it's owned on a deed. When we talk about community property, you're talking about an asset acquired during a marriage, right? And that doesn't apply to a gift or an inheritance. It only applies to an asset acquired using marital funds. Now, this is all a topic for a family law attorney, and I'm much more of a real estate guy, so maybe we should keep it to real estate. If you've made it this far in the video, you're certainly ready for a pop quiz. Can you tell me the difference between tenants in common and joint tenants? If you can't, it's alright. Maybe this reminder will help you. It's what I used to remember this for the bar exam many moons ago, back when my hair was all jet black. Tenants in common. There's 10 aunts. They have something in common. They all own a piece of property. When one of those 10 aunts dies, another aunt steps in. They're always 10 aunts in common. 10 aunts with something in common. When one of them dies, another one steps in. They're always 10 aunts. Joint tenancies maybe are rated a little bit more. If you think about public sentiment when it comes to smoking a joint, you never put it out. It has to be finished. So with joint tenants, let's say there's 10 joint tenants. When one of them fades out, no one comes and joins that circle to finish the joint. The other 9 remain. And when one more dies, then 8, then 7. When you're joint tenants with right of survivorship, your death passes your interest to the remaining survivors, to the remaining joint tenants. Tenants in common, joint tenants. Subscribe over there. Catch another episode of unBILLABLE right down here.